Hear now the reading, the lectionary for this day, a reading from the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel. Hear this word. Now Samuel, the boy, was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose sight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Here am I," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call you, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Then the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make both the ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever." Now Samuel lay there until morning, and he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." He said, "Here I am." Eli said, "What was it that God told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Some years ago now, back in the early 1990s, I was appointed to a church up at the far northern edge of our annual conference, just about 35 miles south of the Chicago Loop. And one of the things that I had to learn in that assignment was how to get around the city on the Metro train. Specifically, I had to learn how to get downtown on the elevated and the Metro trains to make hospital calls there. Most of our folks, when they were ill, found themselves in Chicago area hospitals. And so I had to learn. It was much quicker, eventually, once you learned how to do it, and cheaper parking-wise to get there on the train. And it was a new experience, learning how to be a train commuter. I came from a small town. The only trains I had any experience with were the big freighters that pulled up to the grain elevator, so I knew nothing about trains. But I had to get going on it, and I had to learn fast. In fact, my very first day on the job up there in Manteno, early in the morning, I got called. It was my secretary who said, one of our members was admitted overnight, had a heart attack, and is up at Northwestern, downtown, Northwestern Memorial. And you can get there. If you go now, you can get on the train at the University Park Station and ride the train to Randolph Street. get off, and from there you'll come up and you'll see Michigan Avenue, and it's, from there you know where Northwestern is, just a short walk. And I thought, okay, that sounds easy enough. I'll get going. And what I quickly learned was that, like many things, there is a kind of insider knowledge to train travel that if you don't know it, it can kind of bite you when you're not expecting it. And I had all kinds of those little bites that day as I was making my way to Northwestern. The first of the unspoken rules that I didn't know, I discovered immediately when I got to the University Park train station and pulled into the commuter parking lot. And that was this rule: always, always bring the correct change. Because the parking lot was set up where you would pull into a spot and you would remember your spot number. They were all numbered. And then you were to put $5 into this big box of little slots. The $5 bill was to correspond, of course, to your parking number. And they had a little machine, or a little sign under this that said, no change given, and there was no place to get change. And you can put insert at least $5. And I said, well, why would anybody put more? And then I looked in my wallet and discovered I had two $20 bills. That's what I had. So the train was there. I could see. I didn't know how long it would be. My train that I was to get on was already at the station. So $20, I assumed a $15 tip for the attendant for my parking space that morning. And off I went into the station, where I quickly learned number 2 rule was when you buy your ticket at the station, you put your money into a machine, and it gives you your ticket, and you push for the station where you want to go. Randolph Street was my stop. But it doesn't give change either. It will give you credit on your ticket. You get extra credit on your ticket, but I had two $20 bills. I'd paid one to park, and now my second one was in the machine, and I got a ticket back, and I'm out of money. I'm empty. And I got this train ticket, and I get on the train. At least I'm on, and I figure I've got enough. It was a $6 ride. I figure, well, at least you can get home. But immediately, the thing that I wanted to know was, how long is the ride going to be? Will I know about the Randolph Street stop? I said, there's got to be a schedule on this car somewhere, that tells where the train goes and where it stops. And I looked around and I found the rack where the schedules were supposed to be. But it was empty. It was empty. And there's nothing, sometimes you see them posted on the top of the car. So there's no way to know. The train's moving, it's going north. There's no way to know how many stops till my stop. Where are we going to go? Does it stop every platform? I don't know. And so I turned to the lady next to me across the aisle, and I said, excuse me, ma'am, I've never done this before. This is my first inaugural train ride. How am I going to know when I get to Randolph Street? Because that's where I'm trying to go. And she said, oh, it's not to worry. The conductor's going to come on at every stop, and over the PA, he'll tell you when it's your stop. So just listen and get off when he says Randolph Street. Oh, that's easy enough. And I was very greatly relieved until the train started to slow for the first stop north of University Park. And the PA crackled to life. And over the PA, the conductor said something that sounded very much like this. Next stop, home. I looked at the lady across and I said, what did he say? He said he called out the Homeward Flossmoor stop. I said, how did you understand that? I couldn't understand that at all. And she says, oh, you'll get used to it. It's kind of like an acquired taste. You'll get used to it. It just takes a little time. I said, I don't have much time. I got to know by Randolph Street when it's time to get off. Whereupon the lady got up and switched seats. She left me in the lurch. But that story came to mind in light of that Old Testament reading of somebody desperately trying to make sense of a voice coming to them, a voice that he wanted to understand, but really didn't have much of an idea of what was being said. I think Samuel would understand my train ride very well. Do you remember the background to this story of Samuel and his call and the hardness of hearing that he has to kind of overcome? Samuel was just a boy when his mother, you remember his mother was Hannah, she sent Samuel to live and work in the temple as an apprentice to the priest Eli. Hannah was so delighted to have had Samuel. She regarded Samuel as kind of a miracle baby, and out of just the love for God she had at giving her this son, she dedicated Samuel to God's service, and she sent him to be an understudy under this much experienced and up to then well-regarded priest named Eli. And in many ways, it was a very good arrangement. You know, Samuel had all the energy, all the enthusiasm of youth, and Eli had the experience, the years of service in the temple from which they could both draw. And so off they go on this master-apprentice relationship. And it's not long after that, we're told, that Samuel, in this learning environment in the temple, starts to hear the voice crackling to life over the PA. God is calling, though admittedly he can't understand at all what it is at first. He's asleep and hears the voice call, Samuel, Samuel, and assumes that it's Eli. And he goes to Eli for help. And at first in the story, it seems as though Eli is going to be the goat of the story. He is not interested in Samuel's call at all. He's a little like the lady across the aisle, you know. He seems to just want him to go away. Twice, Eli sends Samuel away, and it looks like Eli is going to be the poster child for what can go wrong in organized religion. I mean, he's supposed to be Samuel's spiritual mentor. He's surrounded, Eli, for his whole life, he's been surrounded by all the trappings of religious life. The text says Eli sleeps right beside the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest thing in all of Israel, the symbol of the presence of God. Eli is steeped in all of the good stuff of religion. And yet, when Samuel comes and says, I'm hearing a mysterious voice calling to me, I'm hearing a voice that's calling my name personally, even then, it doesn't dawn on Eli the priest that it might be God. He says, you know, twice, oh, go back to bed. He's a little grumpier each time, encouraging Samuel just to forget the whole thing, at least at the beginning of the story. And Lord knows, I mean, let's be honest, sometimes it's true that organized religion has sometimes gotten in the way of people's spirituality more than we have wanted to. It's true that sometimes just the momentum of life has kind of led us not to be as responsive or close in our hearing to people who come to us with new visions, you know, some new aspect of worship, some new music, some new form of helping us communicate the gospel better. Sometimes people have started to get excited like Samuel, only to have the church kind of be more like Eli and be grumpy and, you know, squash the enthusiasm and say, just go back to bed. You know, quit waking me up. You're destroying my nap. Eli's circumstance there at the beginning of the story, anyway, reminds me of something I heard from a consultant once. There's a church consultant named Bill Easom who says that just like there are 7 deadly sins that can afflict every individual, so too, Easom says, there are 7 deadly words that can afflict a church. Do you know what the 7 deadly words, according to Bill Easom, of a church are? We have always done it this way. So sometimes the church kind of takes that Eli, at least the early Eli posture, and says, don't get excited, just go back to sleep. You're interrupting my nap here in the temple. But the good news of the story is that if Eli starts out like a curmudgeon, eventually he does get it right. He redeems himself. You notice this in the story? It takes a couple of misses, but finally, the third time Samuel comes in and says, did you call me? Then it starts to dawn on Eli, oh, gee, maybe it's God, and the advice that he gives Samuel is pretty darn good advice. The third time he says, well, try this. Go back and lie down, and if you're awakened again, Just try saying, Lord, speak, your servant hears. Which is kind of perfect counsel when you think about it. He may have started out grumpy, but now he's humble in his advice. He's not pretending that he knows what God is going to try to say to Samuel. He's a very experienced priest, but he's not trying to force-fit Samuel into some predetermined religious direction about what all this call is going to mean for him. He says, basically, just go back to bed, and if you get called, say, Lord, I'm your servant. I'll be open to where you would lead me. I've got my listening ears on, and I will trust you to take it from there. Which, of course, is exactly what happens. It starts Samuel on a path as becoming the new spiritual leader for Israel. First thing he has is a tough assignment, of course. He has to go tell his boss that because his no-good sons have been so disrespectful and Samuel hasn't done enough to rein him in, or Eli hasn't done enough to rein him in, Eli's on the way out and Samuel's on the way up. But it's a task he takes on, and Eli, to his great credit, is remarkably gracious in hearing that what would have been bad news for him, but what turned out to be profoundly good news for the people of Israel. So it's a story about hearing, isn't it? It's a story about calling and openness and hearing. And maybe the biggest point in it is that Samuel's spiritual rising was predicated on that willingness to listen and to trust that it really was God, and to do the hard response, even when it wasn't a task he would have particularly liked. But he does it, and lo and behold, his life comes alive. His life is something really special in the life of Israel. And to extend things in the story a bit, one thing I found valuable from our tradition is the teaching that God really does call all of us, not just the superstars, not just, the Samuels and the disciples and all of that. God calls everybody. Everybody has a calling. Nowadays we tend to think of, we use the language of calling only for, like, ministers get calling. Everybody else has a job. Ministers are still talked about as called, and priests and monks and people who live in monasteries and all of that. But do you know the word vocation and the word vocal, as in call out, vocation and vocal come from the same word. It's the Latin word vocare, which means to call. And it's not an accident that our ancestors linked the word to call with vocation, because they believed that everybody had a calling. The way we spend our time in our waking hours and working hours, that there was a calling in that to, at least in some measure every day, respond to the upward call of God. Another way to say that is, Martin Luther was kind of the most famous in this. Luther talked about the priesthood of all believers, and I think that's exactly what he had in mind. It was that all of us were called to be priests or bearers of the image of God in the way we spend our time every day, whatever it might be. And we were called to, in some way, meet needs that were in harmony with God's purposes through our ordinary day in and day out life. Another way to talk about it, I think, is to say that most often the way that God calls to people is through the gifts that he has given us. God calls you through your gifts. Do you know that? That's what the church has long taught. And sadly, there are a lot of people out there who mistakenly think that they have no gifts, or they confuse being an ordinary person with being giftless in life. And maybe they envy people who are more, at least have more notoriety than they do. These days, we don't use the language of giftedness, I think, in the healthiest way. To talk about somebody as being gifted is shorthand for somebody who we see as exceptional in some way or others. But the church has never thought of being gifted as being exceptional. The church believed way back in Luther's day, and still believes, that everybody is gifted, but what is lacking most often is the right set of listening ears or internal questioning that brings our giftedness to consciousness. When I was out in California a couple of months ago, I met a theologian out there at the Graduate Theological Union. Her name was Rebecca Parker, who's done a lot of work in helping people discover the giftedness of their life. And she says there are just some basic questions it's remarkable that we don't ask ourselves, that if we would ask them on a regular basis, would really make a difference in our spiritual hearing. Among them, she says, are very simple questions like, what is it that sets my heart to singing in life? She says, how often do you ask yourself of that question? What sets my heart to singing, and how can I do something today that will bring that singing to life? Another question that goes along with that, she says, how often do you ask yourself, what is it that my hands long to do, and how can I give my hands those tasks, at least for a little bit of this day? Or another way to say it, when do I lose the smallness of life and get in touch with the wonder and the grandeur and the awe of being alive? And how do I put myself in touch with those times more regularly? They're really questions, when you get right down to it, they're questions about passion, aren't they? What is it that you're passionate about in life? God tends to call us through our passions and our gifts. And when you think about it, the best things we do in life almost always have a dimension of passion behind it. You know, there's things that we really love and we really care about. There's a good story out of the life of Howard Thurman. You remember Howard Thurman, a great African-American theologian, dean at United Methodist Boston University for years, civil rights leader. Some years ago, Howard Thurman was asked to give the commencement address at Howard University. And speaking to those young people on the cusp of newness in their life, kind of still ferreting out where God was calling them to live and to serve, Thurman gave them this wonderful advice. He said, when it comes to contemplating the direction of your life, don't just ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself, what makes me come alive? And go and do that, because what the world needs are people who have come alive. And I really think that's good advice, and that's basically what Samuel found himself doing in response to Eli's suggestion. Go lay down and say, God, here I am, help me come alive. And lo and behold, he did. The time had come in his spiritual life when he could wise up and listen up and glimpse what life is about and discover that faithful living was not just for somebody else, it was an attainable goal for his life, to be a transformative power for God, starting right where he was. And I think we can all discover that if only we will. Nobody said it better than Albert Schweitzer. You know, Albert Schweitzer, the great missionary doctor of the 20th century, he talked about call a lot in his life and felt it powerfully. And one of the things he wrote was this about call. I don't know any better way to close a sermon than with an Albert Schweitzer quote about how God calls. And here's what he says. He said, God comes to us as one unknown. As of old by the lakeside, he came to those who knew him not, and he speaks to us the same word he spoke to them, follow thou me, and sets us to the tasks he has to fulfill in our time. And to those who obey him, be they wise or simple, he reveals himself in the toils, the conflicts, the joys, the sufferings which they shall pass through in this fellowship. It is all, he says, an ineffable mystery, and they shall all of us learn in our own experience just who this calling, talkative God really is. So may it be. Amen.